So with our UVs done, it's time to get to the actual interesting part, the baking. Now, for baking, a lot of people use the method of exploding things, and personally, I'm not a fan of exploding. The main reason for that is I have so many little parts, contrary to a character, which, well, the parts are not going to be more than a couple of dozen. But last time I counted, this thing has more than 200 parts, and I'd have to match up every single one and explode them. There's tools to help you, but even then I have to rename everything. So what I'm going to do is, as you can see, I attached all the unique parts together, and I'm going to create a material now, a multi-sub-object material, with 3 IDs, and I'm going to use the method of matching material IDs on the low and the high poly, so that only matching material IDs are hit. So you can see me create a material here with 3 slots, and each of these slots will have a completely different color. I'm going to stick with the RGB colors, red, pure red. I'm going to go for green, pure green, and the last one will obviously be pure blue. Now, I've made these so wildly different, so it's obvious for me that I can see which part has what color. Now, this is all wrong. I have to completely redo this. So I'm going to make everything my default color, which doesn't really matter that much. I'm just going to pick two. Just going to pick 2 as default color here, just because I like the color green more on the bulldozer. Now, with that done, the whole idea is to go over every single part and try to give them material IDs so that when baked, these material IDs won't intersect with each other. So single meshes should each have, intersecting meshes should have different IDs so that they don't intersect with each other. So these here, I'm going to make these blue because they sit really close to the red ones. These are going to be red then again. So try to space them apart far enough. And it's just rinse and repeat for pretty much every part. You don't necessarily have to do it for every single one. Like this one, I'm keeping it as a few parts I'm giving the same thing, like the bottom holder and the main cylinder. Sometimes you can keep them the same part. For example, when in the high poly, they are one single continuous mesh. Because as you might remember, we haven't modeled this where separate meshes are completely equal on the low and the high poly. So you got to try and mash that up. Now I'm just going to go over the low poly first since, well, this one's the easiest one to do. And also you really want these things to be one single mesh, otherwise it gets really hard to sort of do this stuff. Just going over these parts and selecting them. Now 3 is the absolute minimum that you can work with for something this complex. It might actually be easier to go for 4, but the more you create, the more work you're going to have when baking. So I try to keep it as low as possible, the lowest amount of different material IDs for me to work with. Just going over all of these, changing their colors. And there really isn't that much special to it. And the whole point behind exploding or using this method is, if you're new to normal map baking, if you don't know this yet, is because if you bake something and 2 intersecting meshes, they could hit each other when the projection is done, and you can get interfering projection results where 2 meshes that are not supposed to have normals from each other projecting onto them will have that happen anyway. So it's up to you to go and split these things up. So once again, you can see there are a lot of parts to this thing. I'm pretty sure it's 195 or something for just the low poly. That means about as much for the high poly as well. So I just really don't feel up to changing that and changing all the names on those. I actually started doing it, and I pretty much spent, I think it was close to an hour for about 1/8 of the bulldozer. At that moment I just said, okay, this is not going to work, we're going to go for a different method. It does have some downsides, but these are minimal, I think, compared to the extra cost that you get. Like, one of the downsides is framing occlusion baking. You're going to have to split it up anyway. It just makes it easier. And I might end up splitting it after all. The material IDs just make it easier for me to select these separate parts because I can just select by material ID. So they're sort of like, you're able to create selection sets within your mesh. You should sort of see it like that, and you can match them up with high poly selection sets. So again, going over these parts, like lots of complex small parts like this thing can become slightly annoying. Just moving over every single one of these. And that should be pretty much it for the low poly. I'm going to go over to the high poly now, and I'm hiding all the low poly parts. Let's see, that's the high poly stuff. And I'm just going to assign this material to these things. And the splines are a special case. I'm not actually gonna bake these things because it's not really worth it. These things are pretty much all silhouette, so I don't think it's worth having them in the bake. I need to create a separate ID for them anyway, because they're so tiny and close to everything. That's why I try to avoid this sort of stuff. Now, what I want to do is attach pretty much everything for the high poly together as well. That's one of the downsides. This makes things pretty heavy. You could do without attaching everything together, but the problem is then you can't do everything in a single mesh. You can't select the elements one by one and assign the ID. You have to deselect the object, go to the other one, go over that. And in the amount of clicks, it's probably like 5 clicks more, 10 seconds per object. But again, for up to 200 objects, I do not think that's worth it. Also, it makes it easier for baking, or slightly easier, it's not a big difference. When you add the actual high poly mesh, you only have to add, I think it's up to 3 objects, or just the number of objects that you've eventually ended up with. Again, a bunch of these are attached. I assign the material, then I just unhide some of this stuff so I can do this. Now, it might seem a bit strange that I actually know which color is which, but since I've done this recently, I actually have it in memory what color I assign to certain parts. The colors are very striking, so sort of like my visual memory helps me remember which colors I assign to these parts. If you have trouble with it, you're just going to have to flick between hiding and unhiding the low poly mesh. Also, this is quite a complex thing, matching all of this up, so we're probably going to end up with a few mismatches, and just go back and fix those later. Right now, the whole point is trying to get as close as possible with matching these things up. So again, setting the idea for this one specifically. I'm thinking for this thing here, I'm going to set it to 4, so they end up gray. Gray means I'm just going to skip these things. And this one, again, set it to the default of 1, and then set these parts to 2. Just keep going over them, assigning them one by one. Here's an interesting one. That part over there at the back, in the low poly, it's a single mesh. In the high poly, it's separate pieces, so I assign them the same ID. It's actually the low poly that dictates these IDs. So you shouldn't start with the high poly. If you consider that, don't do it. Start with the low poly and base your material IDs on that. And then go to the high poly and try to match it up. So I'm still holding back on attaching too much stuff here because, well, one of the downsides of attaching this stuff is that Max might chug a little bit on the poly count. And so I'm just trying to keep things separate. Also using the material modifier. It's a modifier that completely overrides an object's material, which makes it quicker to do this on a per object basis. So we've nearly got all of this done. This takes a little bit longer than this actual video lasts. We've just sped this up since it's a bit of a boring task. We're just looking at this, the final ones. Again, for these single objects, it's easier to just paste on the material modifier like I'm doing here. That's pretty much the final one. And that should be it for the material ID video. And for baking in the next one.